Okay. We'll go ahead and get all the logistical stuff out of the way, as we always do in the beginning of these meetings, and give people time to keep filing in. So welcome, everyone. If you're new to the Clinical Athlete Community, or this is your first journal club, thank you for joining us and spending time on your Friday afternoon / evening, or whatever time it is if you're across the globe. As far as participating in these meetings, you've got a few options. You can raise your digital hand. Oh, we got Anna from Australia. That's cool. So you're in the future. You're a future being, Anna. That's awesome. So you can raise your digital hand. There should be an icon somewhere in your Zoom box, your chat box or your Q&A box, where you can raise your digital hand. We can see that next to your name in the attendees list, and then I can unmute you and you can actually talk. It's like it would be like a live radio show. And so you can do it that way. You can participate joining in the discussion through your voice. Your camera won't turn on, so just be your voice and just be mindful of any background noise you have. And then if you don't want to do that, but you still have a question or a talking point, you can put your question in the Q&A box. And this is very important. We're going to make a distinction between the Q&A box and the chat. The chat is where we've got our banter going on right now. And the chat is where you guys can have kind of like a live discussion on your own and share resources back and forth. If you've ever been to like a YouTube or a Facebook Live event, the chat's just kind of rolling. But if you have a question that you specifically want us to bring up during the discussion, put it in the Q&A box. If we see it in the chat, we'll definitely address it, but it's just that things get buried there. So just keep that in mind. And if you also just want to be an active listener and soak up the conversation that way, that's totally fine too. So these meetings are always open to anybody that wants to join in. We do record them, and we put the recordings in the Clinical Athlete Forum, along with all of the other great discussions and resources there for athlete health and performance. So if you're interested in applying and joining the forum, I have just pasted the Clinical Athlete Forum application link in the chat for everybody there, so you can open it up in a new browser and keep it safe. So when you close out Zoom, it's not lost on you. And then I'm also going to give you guys, I know you probably have the download links for the papers anyway, but I'm going to put those here just so you have them again. So there is link to paper number 1 and link to paper number 2. So you have those, you can open them up, and that should take you right to the PDFs of the 2 papers that we're going to discuss during this meeting. And just one more quick note on sound. If you were unmuted and you joined in the conversation, and then later on you're not speaking, just try to mute yourself. Remember to mute yourself, because all your background noise can come through. You don't even know that you're making a sound, but it can be distracting. So if you're not talking, just try to remember to mute yourself. And I think that's it logistically. So with all that said, welcome to the Clinical Athlete Journal Club number 24. My name is Quinn Hennick, and I'm a proud clinical athlete provider. And I'm joined by Kevin McNamara, who's a physical therapist completing a residency at Johns Hopkins. He's a longtime forum member and the one responsible for bringing this journal club to life. So thanks for being here as always, Kevin.
Yes, sir. How is everybody today?
Good, man. I'm excited for this one. And we've got Taylor Allen Flanick, who is a clinical athlete intern. She's also a doctor of chiropractic in upstate New York, a gym owner, and Taylor really helps us by helping us to keep the questions intact and keep the conversation going. And so she'll be joining us tonight as well. Taylor, thanks for being here.
What's up, guys? Thanks for having me.
Yeah, this one should be fun. So if you're curious about the motivation for these meetings, way back in the day, a really smart guy named Benjamin Franklin started a weekly club. They called it the Junto Club, and it was a mutual improvement club. It was basically just a room full of really smart people discussing relevant topics of the day, kind of like what we're doing. And they had an important policy, and we've actually adopted this policy as the Clinical Athlete Journal Club motto. And that is, these meetings are conducted in the sincere spirit of inquiry after truth, without fondness of dispute or desire of victory. So we're all on the same team, and we're just trying to be less wrong. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't disagree and have some great discussion. That just means that we're not coming in here with an agenda trying to win or be right. We're coming in here trying to learn and be less wrong. So that's what we're all sharing that mission together. So tonight's Journal Club topic is training load and injury. And Taylor has actually made some poll questions that will help us get a feel for the room. So I'm going to launch that now, and you should get a few questions kind of pop up in front of you. So the first one is, who are you? Are you a clinician? Are you a student clinician? Are you a coach? Are you a student coach or trainer? So take a few seconds to pop the answers in there if you have any. And then we've got question number 2. Do you guys see the poll? Yeah? Nobody's paying attention. Nobody's answering. Click a button, people. There we go. All right. Question number 2 there. Good. Everybody's like, oh, that thing. How do you, I have to yell at you. How do you manipulate training volume in your athletes to reduce risk of injury? And you can select all that apply there. So far we've got about 50% clinicians, 25% student clinicians, and then a little over 10% each. Few coaches. Cool. So we got a mixed bag as far as the demographic here. That's good. And then the type of training variables that you guys manipulate. A lot of you guys use RPE, external feedback as the coach, internal feedback from the athlete. Most of you guys use that. Some bar speed. Some of you guys are using AC ratios, which we'll talk a lot about, and regular program deloads. A lot of you guys do that. So that's cool. Oh, these are good talking points. Good questions, Taylor. And after number 3, after reading these papers, have they changed their typical ways of manipulating training volume to reduce risk? And about 50-50, yes and no. Cool. And some of you guys may be already familiar with some of the stuff that we're going to talk about as far as the critiques of some of these things, but I'll go ahead and share the results so you guys can see them. Jessica says, chill, give us a second. All right, fine. I feel like I gave you like 5 seconds and you guys were just ignoring me. It hurt my feelings and I got anxious. I'm sorry. Okay, cool. So these 2 papers, they're actually preprint. If you're wondering why the format was kind of wonky, like it didn't look super clean and the figures were at the end of the paper. So these will officially be published later where they look cleaner, like a actual JOSPT article and research article that you guys are used to. But it's a 2-part series, and the title of the first paper is Training Load and Injury, Part 1. The Devil is in the Detail. Challenges to applying the current research in the training load and injury field. And this was a pretty short one, and just kind of like setting the stage for Part 2, which was titled Training Load and Injury Part 2, Questionable Research Practices Hijack the Truth and Mislead Well-Intentioned Clinicians. So this group of authors, Franco Impellizzeri he's Italian, but he's out in Australia, and he's been in the training load field and doing these things for over 2 decades. So session RPE, if you guys are familiar with session RPE, Franco was one of the first coaches and researchers to actually validate that measure back in 2003. So he's been doing this for a long time. And some of the critiques in these papers, he's been pretty vocal about the last couple of years. So he actually was on the Clinical Athlete Podcast, episode 29. If you guys remember that one, if you haven't listened to it, it was a really good conversation that we had with him. Patrick Ward, the second author, is actually a head of research and development for the Seattle Seahawks. And he's a data scientist and like a genius. He's one of those guys that kind of makes you nervous, just how smart he is. And Aaron Coots is another, has been doing fantastic research for a long, long time. Luke Bourne is a data scientist. I think he works for the Kings. And Alan McCall works with Arsenal Football Club. So these are people who have contributed greatly to the field already. So just give you an idea of who's writing this paper, who's actually speaking here. So these papers are not studies. These are clinical commentary papers. So it's really going to lend itself well to discussion here. So I want you guys, make sure you chime in with everything. I'm going to briefly go over some of the things here, and then I'll throw it to Kevin. I'll throw it to the rest of the crew here, and we can just get the conversation started. But part one of this two-part series is kind of setting the stage here, introducing the idea of the relationship between training load and injury. And I think one of the big points here was that it's not just about training load and injury, but these are questions about research in general and how practitioners should be cautious in how they read and interpret findings just in general. And they're using training load as a prime example of this, and kind of set the stage for the acute to chronic workload ratio as kind of being the thing that is the main talking point here. But the critiques and the principles that they talk about, understand that these are across the board in any metric or outcome that we're looking at. So it's very relevant if you're a coach or a clinician for any quality that is to be studied. And so right off the bat here in part one, it was kind of a critique in regards to almost making the AC ratio is almost a too simple of a metric. We want simple solutions for complex problems, but we don't want oversimplification, and which it kind of ignores the nuance and the multifactorial complexity of something like injury risk. So that was kind of a general critique. And then they get into some of the questionable research practices, or QRPs, was really just saying, be aware that there are questionable research practices. And that was basically what part two is all about. So part one is almost just a preface to part two here. And so I'm going to kind of get into that, but I do like figure one. So if you look in part one, page 6, there's a little model here in regards to the research process. And I think this is important, especially in the training load research data, where a lot of this research is coming from almost an inductive approach, where you have the data already, and now you're looking at the data and you're trying to create hypotheses and theories based on data that's already collected. So you come into it with your own biases and like kind of seeing what you want to see, and then you pull what you want essentially to fit your model and to fit your hypothesis. And that's what harking is hypothesizing after you already know the results of the data. And then you can just kind of dip into the data and over and over and over until you find something, and that's called p-hacking. And so part one is kind of prefacing that these things can happen in research, and they seem to be really prevalent in the training load research. And so that's what figure one in part one of this paper is kind of showing you. It's showing you the process of research, but then it's highlighting some of the pitfalls that can come along the way. And then in part two is basically outlining all of the ways that research can be limited. And it's using training load and the acute to chronic workload ratio as kind of the poster boy for examples of each research or methodological fallacies that we make in regards to drawing conclusions and inferences and connecting causality and confusing causality with association. So as just a broad brush here, we're setting the stage to essentially poke holes in a very common metric that's been popularized over the last 5 years or so, which is the acute to chronic workload ratio. So we use that specifically, but this can be a broader discussion as well. So I'm going to throw it to Kevin from that and just kind of see what his thoughts were on these papers in general, and then we'll throw it to the group.
Yeah, I mean, I think these papers, we can go a lot of ways in direction in terms of conversation, I think, with this, because it kind of speaks to not only just research, maybe problems or shortcomings specifically with regard to the acute to chronic workload ratio, but kind of just research in general. And it's tough because I've definitely feel like I've been victim to maybe kind of jumping on board with a lot of the acute to chronic workload ratio stuff. It definitely gravitated towards that more so. And then, this is probably a shortcoming on my own part here. I don't feel like I have a great enough command of some of the subject matter with sort of the intricacies of the statistical procedures per se to necessarily be able to kind of pinpoint out, some of the problems when we're talking about like rolling averages, et cetera. Some of the differences that we can see in absolute risk versus relative risk and things like that. So I think I resonate with these papers because I feel like I've been in that position where I've maybe misinterpreted things or maybe taking things a little bit too far with regard to utilizing some of the research surrounding this. And then I think they do a good job in the second paper here, kind of just bringing forth some of the and highlighting some of the problems with the ratios in particular, as well as in many ways, sort of the narrative that has been created where when you look at actually the individual studies, for the most part, things come out to be relatively equivocal, saying that we can't really make any sort of claim one way or another. And I wasn't necessarily really aware of some of those findings that actually showed results in sort of the opposite direction. So to me, I think these papers were really good to not only highlight some of my own limitations in terms of making statistical inferences, but also just kind of recognizing that, I've fell victim to maybe taking things and applying them to such a degree that maybe extend beyond what we actually know from the literature. So I think it's a really good thought experiment, utilizing something like this topic in particular, but also kind of opening the conversation to, where else are we maybe doing this same sort of thing?
So your point on the results being equivocal, meaning we're seeing some papers showing. I'm going to explain AC ratios explicitly here in a second, just if people are still kind of unfamiliar with that, because I think these papers almost assume a certain degree of understanding coming into them, not from a statistical standpoint necessarily, but just what are AC ratios. So we'll parse that out specifically here in a bit, but how there's some papers showing reduced risk in a certain range of ratio, and then increased risk on the outsides of the tails, but then other papers showing the opposite, and then other papers showing no effect. The risk is the same across the board. And you know what I've noticed? So with that, you take that particular metric with a grain of salt. If you're coming into it kind of open to it, you're like, well, I'm not seeing anything that's swaying me one way or another. But what I've seen actually over the past 5 years is that more like commentaries come out based on a small degree or small number of studies. And that's kind of one of the big cruxes here is like there's more clinical commentaries about the AC ratio than there are actual hard, reliable data. But some of the commentaries that I see is it's don't train too much was like the initial narrative. And then we start to see, well, if you train a lot, there's a paper or two that shows decreased risk. So then it's like, well, train harder and smarter. Don't just train smart. So it's almost like the narrative was changing to try to fit all of the findings. And that it just becomes really hard to actually make that meaningful from a decision-making standpoint, because then it's like, if nothing matters, if everything matters, nothing matters. And we're seeing this across the board. How do I actually use it in practice? And so an acute to chronic workload ratio, and if you didn't get it from the papers, we're trying to quantify a person's short-term fatigue compared to their preparation or compared to their fitness. And there are many, many ways to calculate it. And that's one of the problems, is that you can't compare two studies if they used a different definition of injury, if they use a different way to calculate the ratio. It's apples to oranges. But anyway, a common way to calculate AC ratios is to take the most recent week of training, to take an average of the training load. And now what does training load mean? Well, it's whatever metric you decide to use, which is another thing. But a lot of times it's session RPE multiplied by the time of the training session. So it's an arbitrary unit, literally AUs. So they take the average AUs of 1 week, That's your numerator of the ratio. That's the top number, which is essentially the number that we're trying to control for. In a ratio, the numerator is what we're trying to control for. The denominator is what kind of isolates the numerator and controls for it. But then we take that week over an average of the last 3 to 5 weeks. And again, lots of studies use different time frames, but it's typical to use 4 weeks. So your training load of the past week over your training load over the past month gives you this kind of fatigue over fitness model. And then that, whatever that ratio falls on, we're trying to take that number and say, based on that ratio, you have decreased risk of injury, no change, or you have an increased risk of injury. That's what an AC ratio is. So you can think of, like, just me even going through that, you can think of all of the questions that come with that. Are we including all types of practice, or is it just field practice? Is it weight room practice? What metric are we using? Why can't I use the last 2 weeks for acute load versus 1 week? And then Kevin brought up rolling averages. So most of the time, those 4 weeks in that chronic denominator is just an average of the 4 weeks. It's a rolling average. It's just week 1 plus week 2 plus week 3 plus week 4 divided by 4. But one of the arguments is that is not as accurate, because the idea is that your more recent training has more of an effect on your fatigue. So the argument is that you should use an exponentially weighted average, and the more recent weeks should have more of an effect. So there's that argument too. And then one of the biggest statistical arguments against using the AC ratio is that in the first studies that really were the foundation of everything that built upon that, the acute week, the one that's on the numerator, was also included in the 4 weeks of the denominator. That's called a coupled ratio. That's not good statistics. That's not good science, because now you have data that's affecting both the numerator and the denominator. Ratio is supposed to be factors of different constructs. So that's what they would call in statistics a spurious correlation. So you want an uncoupled ratio. And so there's been a few more studies trying to do that, but so there's just a lot. It was built on some really questionable methodology from the beginning, I guess is the point here. And then it just grew into this thing where we're like, oh, wow, it's so deeply rooted now in sports science, but yet there's these limitations.
Yeah, and I think you brought up a good point, and it really kind of speaks to their kind of main driving statement towards the end, where we basically did this research without having like a solid framework to start from. And I think that's why it's kind of become this sort of amorphous, ever evolving thing where, like, well, it's not just, train harder, it's train smarter. It's because we didn't really have anything established from the get-go to kind of anchor us to anything. So now it's just, and this is something that Franco talks about too, is it lacks an element of practicality when you really start to look at it and all the elements that go into it. Because I don't know how much it really guides your decision making, because obviously you have to train to induce positive and meaningful adaptations. And I think that's where the whole element of like the 0.8 to the 1.3 ratio really kind of falls apart, because it lacks any sort of accounting for contextual factors, the need to drive certain adaptations. So you're almost left in this position where, like, okay, well, last week they were at a 2 or something like that. So what does that mean for this week? Do I allow them to their chronic training load to drop down, take it off this week, manipulating the acute ratio? So I just think, to me, I feel like I don't know that it really guides my decision making to such a degree that I found it all that helpful, really.
One of the big things, so I'm going to touch on one of Logan and Travis have questions here that I'm seeing, and I'm going to hit. Travis has a really interesting question and I'm going to hit Logan's first, actually, because I think it's more relevant to what we're talking about right now. Logan asked, I can understand why you can cause problems with the data if you p-hack your own paper, but if someone else tries to replicate the study design without p-hacking and just focuses on the variables of the previous study that was p-hacked, wouldn't that be a valid study? It's a good question, Logan. I have some thoughts on here. I'll throw it to Kevin and then can throw it to anybody else again in the chat here. But if the study that you're trying to replicate wasn't founded on valid constructs in the first place, well, now you're just replicating the same problems. So it goes back to Kevin's point that what Franco's big point here is in part 2 is you have to start with some type of framework. You have to start with the hypothesis before you have the data. So if I'm trying to replicate a previous study that didn't do that, it's just more of the same. So you have to come into it with some hypotheses, with a framework based on priors, and this is where it gets tough because you're basically trying to disprove your model. And that's why science is frustrating, because a lot of times you won't find anything. And then you have to, like Franco said in the paper and team, you have to go back to the drawing board and rehash your hypotheses and see where it fell apart. But that's the process here. Instead, what seems to be happening is that nothing is ever disproven, because you can always go back into the data and fit it to a new hypothesis that you made. So again, if your anchor is that first data set or that first group of studies that didn't do this properly, then you're not anchored to anything valid and reliable and sound. So it's almost like you have to wipe the drawing board clean again and start anew. I don't think this damns the concept though. And I don't think these papers, so Franco's big thing is he doesn't like how it's been commercialized and now there's being money made literally specifically on the acute to chronic workload ratio. And it's in athlete monitoring systems. It's like built into the functions now. It's like really widespread. And that's his problem. His problem is not the concept. His thing is if you're gonna, it's an interesting idea that now needs to be studied properly. So that would, and I'm getting far afield from Logan's question, but I think Logan, that's where the disconnect is. You can't keep pulling on a foundation made of sand. You're going to sink at some point. Kevin, do you have any thoughts on that?
No, because it would just be, like you said, it's just new data points through a similar flawed system in which they were run through. So it doesn't really get at the heart of kind of the problem, which is accounting for all of these various factors and shortcomings or pitfalls that they're talking about.
And so practically, with one reason, let's say that these were, that it wasn't this way, and it was built upon kind of deductive reasoning where we had a hypothesis and we had a model based on our priors, and then it's been tested over the last 5 to 10 years and it's been pretty strong. And now here we are. You would even still need more, because I see some barbell sport coaches and coaches in other sports using AC ratios in populations that haven't been studied yet, and also with metrics that haven't been studied yet. But they're using the same ratio that's based on the studies on field sport athletes that used session RPE or GPS data in like Australian rules football or soccer or rugby or something like that. And then they're saying the 1.3 ratio from that population and that sport and that metric now applies to a power lifter with volume load on the bench press. It does not work like that. That's completely separate. Those ratios in the studies now don't apply to any other sport or any other metric. The principle of doing too much too soon or not doing enough over time to prepare, that construct is still relevant. It's just that we need to study that individual population with that individual metric to be able to make these inferences. And that's assuming that we have a solid foundation of methodological principles that this is based on. So for me, there is no utility at the moment for a specific AC ratio because it doesn't, like you said already, Kevin, it doesn't inform me. It actually creates more noise.
Yeah. And I mean, even to kind of touch on that a little bit more is, this same ratio has been utilized and there's no really accounting for, obviously certain training is going to have different sort of demands and maybe, different fatigue inducing properties to it, but we're still kind of using that that golden ratio, or like that's that green zone of, 0.8 to 1.3, and not really accounting for, what's the actual stimulus that's being applied within the training session, and does that, influence relative risk. So it all kind of just goes into the same bucket, and we're just kind of marking it as a whole. And I think that's something that is a problem, because I think anybody can attest to this, that's trained on their own. Certain training modalities, certain sessions will leave you more drained, more or less, than others. And I think that's something that is also something that's not really accounted for, is the demand differences between something like max effort sprints versus tempo running or lower intensity conditioning, etc. But we're still kind of counting them all in one. And I think that's where I kind of have some issues with it as well.
Or not counting some subset of their training at all. So GPS, only putting the AC ratio on the GPS data, which is like the running and the practice, but then foregoing the weight room stuff, like not even including that, as if it doesn't have an effect on fatigue and fitness. And another thing here that I think is important to parse out, and practically as well, is that these two papers are actually watered down versions of two papers that this group put out or wrote, yet to be accepted and published last year. And this goes along with Travis's question here. Is Travis asked, why do you think these are in JOSPT specifically, as opposed to another journal like BJSM or Sports Medicine? I'm going to answer that with some back end knowledge and some inside knowledge, but a lot of speculation. So this would be a question that you ask Franco directly, because he's pretty open about this stuff. But it's my understanding that BJSM doesn't accept a lot of the publications of this particular group for their own reasoning, but for potential implicit bias, because a lot of the commentaries on training load and the AC ratio specifically you will find in BJSM. So JOSPT maybe doesn't care as much, and they just accepted it. So why JOSPT? Potentially they were just one of the journals with a decent impact factor that accepted the papers, and BJSM wouldn't. But I would ask Franco that directly to get a better answer. So now this group has two other papers, and I'm going to actually ask Franco if I can share these in the forum or share them later, but they're basically more detailed versions of what the two papers that we read. And Franco brings up a really, really interesting point, and the group brings up an interesting point, that association and prediction are not the same as causality. So we all know that association is not causation, or we've heard that correlation does not equal causation. So when the rooster crows and the sun comes up, does the rooster's crow mean that caused the sun to come up? No, they're associated, but there's no arrow of directionality, of causality there. It's just association. But prediction is also not causality. And he talked about that a little bit in the papers that we read, but there's another paper that he gives a really poignant example of this, in that we're trying to use training load as a metric that predicts injury. And in some of the papers, it does have a little bit of predictive power, so that's all of these shortcomings methodologically aside, there seems to be an association between training load and injury. And in some of these papers that use predictive models, there seems to be a relationship between the ability to predict injury and training load. But that doesn't mean that training load causes the injury. So they gave an example of the fact that shark attacks and ice cream sales are strongly associated. So this is like a thing that you can look up. It's one of these weird things. Shark attacks and ice cream sales are strongly associated. So strongly, in fact, that you could predict to some accurate degree the number of shark attacks based on the number of ice cream sales. But we all know, based on common sense, that if you change the number of ice cream sales, that's not going to affect shark attacks. So just because you have a predictive metric on something else doesn't mean that if you change the predictor, it's going to change the outcome. And that's one of the big points here is potentially think about training load as the ice cream. Think about injury as the shark attacks. We change ice cream, doesn't change shark attacks. There's some other underlying constructs that would have to be affected to reduce the risk of shark attacks. And Franco and their team their construct is tissue specific strength, and tissue specific capacity to stress and strain. And your training then is based on that. Now that's not perfect either, because we have to measure those things, and basically we only have a proxy, like, well, your back squat got stronger, I can only assume that your tissues also got stronger, that type of thing. But my point here is, just because we identify a predictive relationship between training load and injury doesn't mean that if you just arbitrarily try to decrease or increase volume to try to change injury risk, it doesn't work like that necessarily. I just wanted to make that point.
So Carrie said, I feel like it would be extremely difficult to conduct a truly perfect study on the effects of training load on injury risk, especially because there are too many variables to control for in the first place, like history of injury, years of experience, sleep, overall physiological stress, etc., things like that.
Oh, I mean, I think, Carrie, you're spot on. That's what makes this so hard. And it's also why p-hacking is such a problem, because you're already ignoring these other factors. But I will say this, to try to identify causality, I mean, we can set up controlled studies, which we know a very controlled experimental study lacks kind of the real world application, because you are controlling for all of those factors. But if they could over time set up more controlled studies, have an initial model to look from and say, I hypothesize that this factor affects this factor, and then set up a study looking just at that, over the course of time, you can start to build a body of evidence that supports the model. And over time, you start looking at the interactions of all these different factors, and you can start to build upon that. So each study kind of leads into the next, and you know where you're going next, instead of these one-off studies that don't lead anywhere. So Carrie, while I 100% agree with you, it's such a hard thing to study, and we're always going to be wrong. And that was a point I think Franco made in these papers, or another one where he says, like, we're always just essentially making our best guess based on our prior information and our expertise and our interpretation of the evidence. So we're never going to know if we're right. But I think if we start with a better foundation, we can have a better shot at making more accurate inferences. Travis, on that note, says, he says, in a large scale RCT, you could theoretically equate all of those variables between groups, but for whatever reason, probably because it's hard to do RCTs, no one seems willing to conduct that type of study. There could also be ethical issues with subjecting people to high AC ratios. I would also say, Travis, it's really hard because a lot of these studies are done on pretty high level, like they're like in-season teams. And so you almost have to change their training to accommodate the study design. And as a head coach or a team manager, going to be like, yeah, sure. Like you said, Travis, like, yeah, sure, they can train really, really hard for the sake of this study. Just, forget our plan to try to win these games, or so it's really, really tough to do.
So Derek just asked, because the AC ratio is so linear and doesn't account for many of the other factors that can be associated with injury, if we solely focus on this aspect, can we do more harm than good in preventing injury due to not seeing the entire picture?
Potentially. I think that was one of the points that one of those papers made too, is we become so myopic in our thinking, we miss a lot of stuff. And yeah, it's almost like in this case, bad data is worse than no data, because it leads us down a rabbit trail and away from it, like we're in a path towards the noise instead of the signal. So I definitely think there's a chance of that. And they also said, your job could be on the line too, because if you put all your eggs into this basket, like, hey, coach, management staff, I'm going to reduce injury risk because we're going to use this super awesome fancy metric called the AC ratio. And then over the course of the season, it doesn't play out like that. You seem kind of silly. Yeah, it didn't work. So that's not a good look if you put all your eggs into one basket. And that goes for any metric, any one metric. And I think that's just a big point overall, is even if this was all sound and we were like AC ratios are really powerful and they're based on some really, really good data, it's still only going to be one piece of the pie.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of speaks to the larger issue of like even like the framework that they kind of put forward. Man, like think about all the work that would have to go into like looking at each individual piece of that to finally get to a point to where like now we've developed what we think is this ideal framework for reducing injury risk. There's so many components and so many things that would have to be done in that there. I don't honestly don't even know if it's even feasible to create a framework to account for all these variables, to have, good data behind it, to kind of uphold the framework itself. So it kind of seems like we're kind of chasing a rabbit that you can't really catch when it comes to injury reduction.
And in table 1, so not only are there a lot of factors to look in table 1 of the second paper, they show you all of the ways to even do the research, like all of the ways to define acute, define chronic, define injury. Some of these studies include contact injuries. It's just like the same argument as the FMS and movement screening too. Like, why would you include contact injuries that AC ratios have no control, or training load in general, no control over that whatsoever?
Yeah, and on the other side of that, some of them just can include like just complaints, just like all complaints was factored in for an injury.
Yeah, exactly. It's so hard. Like, so for example, if clinicians and coaches or student clinicians in the room, imagine that every time that you walked into a gym and all the members know that you're a chiro or PT or a doc or whatever, and they're like, oh, like, go for this little elbow thing. What do you think I should do? And it's like, those dozens of 3-minute conversations that you have with people. Some studies, every time you do that, it's an injury. Even if the person doesn't change their routine, it doesn't affect them and it's gone the next day. Just the fact that they sought an opinion is classified as an injury. Now that's okay. If every study defined it the same, it's like, okay, at least we have something reliable to go off of, but it's just that it's another apples to oranges comparison. And now you're looking at 2 different studies that have like 7 different apples to oranges comparisons when you're trying to equate all of these little things that go into it. And you start to just kind of throw up your hands on all this stuff and say, you know what, just add 5 pounds to the bar and see how you feel. And I think practically that's where I am with things right now is I program in short bursts. So I know where kind of I want to head. I still have a plan. But the actual nuts and bolts of the program, I almost never program more than 4 weeks at a time. Like specifically the program, here's what you're going to do. Here's the next month. I used to program like 12, 16-week blocks or even more, like the perfect program, and then something would always go off the rails and I'd have to just change it up as a waste of time. But it's not uncommon, especially with my rehabbing athletes, where their situation is so volatile. It changes so readily from day to day. I'm programming a week at a time, sometimes half a week at a time, kind of knowing where I want to head if things go well, but not jumping there yet in case we have to kind of switch gears. And so because it's so volatile like that, tracking a specific ratio of a metric is so hard to do because it's going to change. The data is going to look so skewed. It's not going to be pretty for this individual. It's just going to look like junk and noise. And I use SRPE for a lot of my athletes just as like a keep my thumb on the pulse kind of thing. It's literally just like, oh, they rated this session as a 7. Yeah, I pretty much kind of want it to be a 7, but it's more like the big outliers. Like they rated the session as a 9.5. I'm like, whoa, okay. And I kind of look and they, weights kind of went down from last week. They say they feel real beat up. And now it's almost like a conversation starter. But that's much different than trying to take that data and make it fit into a specific metric all of its own, and then have that drive my decisions. I'm like going way far afield here, but.
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
So from both of your experiences, basically what you're saying then if I'm understanding correctly, would be that obviously we're going to take like the science as like our foundation to making a lot of these decisions and like how we move forward with some of this stuff. However, there's also an art to it where you're communicating with your athlete, you're seeing how they move, and you're adjusting kind of like as necessary. Yes? No?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'm a shitty artist, so, but yeah, I mean, this, the science. So the point here is, I think the argument for AC ratios is it potentially should be one of your KPIs. Like it's actually a foundational metric that when you have it in front of you drives your intervention and your decision making. That's kind of how it's been espoused up to this point in some circles. And it doesn't seem to have that type of power. So then we have to really think about, well, what is it that we truly care about? Are we getting too far afield from the things that matter? And we're almost losing touch with what's happening on the day-to-day and the week-to-week progression. Like, if you're a powerlifter, your KPIs are some estimation of your 1 rep max squat, bench, and deadlift. That doesn't mean you're maxing out your squat, bench, and deadlift every week, but based on RPEs and what weights you're hitting for certain rep ranges, what proximity you are to your best. And those are your, nuts and bolts KPIs. When we start to try to take a KPI and link it to injury, this is one way, this is how we kind of get into trouble because of the multifactorial nature of injury and kind of what we're talking about. It's like a whole nother animal that doesn't have a model to even start from.
Yeah, I mean, you kind of took the words out of my mouth there, honestly. Like just looking at the acute to chronic workload ratio by itself, there's almost like a disconnect from like reality. I'd say especially from like a rehabilitation standpoint, just because you mentioned how, the person's so different every time they're coming in. It is a volatile situation, which is that's not to say that it doesn't have value. Like it can be a factor that you're kind of monitoring, but this idea that it's kind of like the factor, it doesn't seem to be panning out so much, which is why, kind of like the emergence of more of like an agile periodization approach, like, Madeline Jovanovic, is that was his last name, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Just seems to have much more of a practical utility than something that is kind of like just a constant metric that you're monitoring to utilize to guide programming. That's kind of what I would think. So it's not so much an art, maybe it's just more of an ability to kind of bounce back and forth and be fluid in your programming, I would say.
I want to share something that you guys didn't see because it's in one of the papers I talked about that I don't even know if Franco wants me to share, but I'm just going to share one of the figures because I think that would be fun regardless. And I'm going to share my screen, which always goes poorly, but can you guys, Kevin, Taylor, see my screen? Okay. So this is one of the figures, and just thinking as a mental model, like trying to really bring it down to something tangible and simple. We think about this relationship between external and internal load, which, by the way, Franco, and it might have been Aaron Coots, the second author, but Franco's got a really great paper from 2 years ago about external and internal training load. It's open access. Just type in Franco's name, Franco Impellizzeri, and external training load, internal training load, and it'll pop right up. It's a really, really good piece. Think of external training load as kind of the outside stress that you're putting on the athlete. So the weight on the bar, the volume, the mileage that you're having them run or swim or whatever. And you expect some type of internal psychophysiological response from that external load. So when I put 90% of 1 rep max back squat on somebody's back, I expect some type of internal psychophysiological response from that. And that's internal load. Now, because it's hard to actually measure what's going on at the tissue and system level, we have proxies for internal load like RPE. So if I prescribe 90% for a back squat double, that's the external load prescription. And then I expect that to be about an 8 RPE. I'll put 8 RPE. That's the internal load prescription. And then they do it So what I prescribe and then what they actually do, I compare those things. So if 90% ended up being RPE 10, then I say, okay, that internal load was more than what I had bargained for. It was actually more than what I wanted to subject to them. And so I then change my prescription or alter my intervention. Or maybe I don't do anything. It was just a shitty day and you just chalk it up to that. But that's what we're kind of talking about with the interplay between external and internal load. Now, internal load can be measured by other stuff too. Heart rate is an example of internal load. EMG and lactate accumulation, if you're in a lab, stuff like that. And then we assume some type of adaptation. So this is where, the training, the KPIs come in. So if my estimated 1 rep max is improving, or my mean aerobic speed, or whatever vertical jump, or whatever metric that you're tracking as kind of your key performance indicator, if that's improving or decreasing, this is the line here. And then your feedback loop is maybe the program, looking at the program and looking at the trends over time, or having a test day, or your feedback loop is literally the feedback between you and the athlete, their RPE ratings, so it's this constant loop. And here's, all the factors plus many others that you guys could probably think of that influence the adaptation that occurs between the interplay of external and internal load. AC ratio, or some of these generic training load metrics, are almost trying to be a panacea for this. And it's almost like its own separate dotted line here, where you could look at training load metric just by itself and assume some type of training outcome based on that specifically, or injury risk, change this to injury risk. And it just doesn't seem to play out that strongly. So I wanted to share that and just to see if that was helpful for people to kind of bring it home a little bit.
Here's a thought to kind of think about with regard to like the acute to chronic ratio. So if we go back to like that, the training outcome, do you think it could be useful as like a metric to determine whether or not, okay, let's say like over this course, this 5-week period of time, their acute to chronic workload ratio was 1.4. And then you kind of utilize that to look at, okay, what was the training outcome? If we saw like a positive change in the KPIs that were important to us, maybe that's a way to think about, the AC ratio as, okay, like this was the current workload that they needed over this course of time to demonstrate that positive change in the training outcome. So maybe thinking about, that's just kind of came to me right there, but almost thinking about it kind of in reverse as, this is the amount of stimulus that is needed based off of the training that we prescribed to move the needle in a positive direction for that training outcome. That's just kind of like a random thought I had there, but.
No, I think that's what's more appropriate. Is it AC ratio is another piece of data that you would put. Now what you consider it either internal or external, which is an interesting discussion, because if the metric is session RPE multiplied by the minutes of the session, which a lot of times is how they're doing the arbitrary unit, time of the session is oftentimes considered external load variable, whereas session RPE is oftentimes considered an internal load variable. So it's almost like this hybrid. But essentially what you're saying, I think, is that an AC ratio could just be another data point that falls within this interplay of other variables that you look at. And yeah.
Does that make sense? What I'm saying is like, it's almost like you can utilize it as a way to, okay, this was the training stimulus that I imposed over this course period of time. And this seemed to be, associated with a positive change in the KPI that was of interest to us. So that kind of gives you an understanding of this was the amount of training that was needed to make that change.
Oh, I think so. I just think you could make that argument for whatever internal or external load metric that you feel is relevant. AC ratio just happens to be one option amongst the plethora. And then the discussion would just be what's more important to attribute to the training outcome. But now we're assuming that the AC ratio is calculated on valid methodology. So this is like an alternate universe to even have it in that discussion, because estimated 1 rep max or barbell velocity or just 1 rep max, those are more reliable and just kind of closer to the ground in regards to what they are. If you do a 1 rep max squat, you know, it may not have been your absolute 1 rep max, maybe off, you know, plus or minus, or probably, or minus 5 kilos or whatever, because you technique and you didn't have 1 pound change plates to just chip away at the next thing, but it's still pretty close. And AC ratio is like potential, you know, it's a proxy. And so you're pulling further from a specific quality, but yeah, no, I hear what you're saying. It just falls over kind of in the mix of variables that you're considering.
Yeah, and I would agree. I mean, it's so far removed at that point that it probably would be something that's less of sort of an indicator, but just kind of something I was thinking about with it.
I'm not forgetting about it. Like I still have my ear to the ground on it. You know, if for people who took the CWC or the clinical athlete weightlifting course more than 2 years ago, you would remember seeing AC ratios in my lectures. But what's interesting is I would basically follow it up with like 27 caveats. So it was like, here is an AC ratio. I think it's important to understand because you're going to see it in the literature and it has some plausibility. The concept makes sense. And so I would teach it to them. And then I would follow it up with, oh, by the way, it doesn't apply to weightlifters because they're not how they're studied. And there's this methodological flaw. And it's like, I'm like debunking what I just taught them. And it didn't make any sense. It's like, why am I even teaching it if I'm just going to add a bunch of caveats and I'm not even going to use it? So that's kind of the evolution that I've gone through now, but I'm still like paying attention. And if, you know, I think the big call out here is if other researchers want to take this and say, well, I still think there's something here, but let's create a better foundation. Like, please do. I'm all for it, you know, as a practitioner. Cool. Taylor, do we have anything? So I shut up and get the people involved.
Anna said, how would you estimate training load fatigue in a youth population who participate in different sports?
Oof. It's really hard. So I don't know if RPE scores are going to work there with the kids. We may be looking at more of kind of their objective data. And so I would have to ask you, like, what are you tracking now? And I'm just going to assume you don't have GPSs attached to them where you're getting kind of like peak velocities and you're seeing peak velocities drop or that type of thing. So, you know, it might just be the eyeball test, kind of seeing if you're seeing any degradation in performance or if they seem tired or they seem like they're more mischievous, like they're not paying attention as much. Almost can manifest with kids where they're tired and so they start acting out a little bit. I don't know how young these kids are. If they're teenagers, you can start to employ some of this more advanced stuff because they can conceptualize it a little bit better. But I think it would depend on some stuff. Kevin, do you have any thoughts there? If
I think that's one of the real problems with is, you know, from like a bioplausibility aspect, like you mentioned, like it kind of gravitates or works better with a lot of kind of like the field-based stuff where you do have access to things like accelerometers or, you know, catapult systems or something like that. And that's the real issue with trying to apply it broadly is, you know, the demands from sport to sport are so different that it really falls apart. So I don't know how you would even utilize it successfully in something where they're playing multiple sports. The demands are so different across. And this is even something like in a sport like gymnastics or something like that. There's people that are trying to do the same sort of thing, but it's so different. And the stimulus and the gameplay is so far removed from something like field sport athletes where a lot of this has been done that I don't know how useful it really is or what you would really get, what information you would get from it.
Yeah, I think that's just a matter of just old school, paying attention and kind of having a plan, but also having a plan B, C, D in your back pocket at all times. And sometimes even like kid specific. You have anything else, Taylor? I'm going to launch one more. I made like an intra-meeting poll question just to keep people engaged, but.
At the gym, we actually have like a somewhat large population of youth, and that kind of varies. The youngest from like maybe 11 or 12, depending on like how mature and how long their attention span is and their ability to pay attention and stuff like that. And a lot of it does come down to like external versus internal load, feedback, recovery tracking, asking a lot of questions, things like that.
Yeah. It's a lot of paying attention. So I just launched a question to you guys. Is this conversation making you think about how you program for yourself or your athletes? So far, 100% of you say yes. While we're sitting here, I was first introduced to these, or I would say maybe not first, but a really good presentation from Franco, like a PowerPoint, it's a video on YouTube that he made about this. And that's kind of what really started the public conversation. I have just, I did something weird. I'm putting it in the chat. It's a YouTube video. It's really good. Now, Franco has a pretty thick Italian accent, so it takes a bit to kind of, your brain has to rewire to get used to it, but it's really good. So it's in a PowerPoint, and so I'd open that YouTube video. I just put it in the chat. Anna asked, she followed up on the youth question. Should we concentrate more on injury prevention and recovery for the youth then? My bias is somewhat in line with, I think, this author group, in that I concentrate on performance and injury and then mitigating injury risk within that, which comes down to a lot of intuition and common sense and just reacting retroactively, as in that's not prevention. So I don't know if there's going to be a specific thing that you're implementing for injury prevention. I think injury prevention might just be embedded within just kind of a smart training program where you as the coach are paying attention and you feel that you're progressing them within their means. Now you could make an argument with something like a Nordic hamstring curl, where you could say, there's such a body of evidence to show that on average, this seems to reduce the pooled injury rates. I'm just going to throw Nordic hamstrings in there. And my frame of reference is to reduce hamstring injury risk. But you could also make the argument that it's changing the architecture of the hamstrings and potentially augmenting some type of performance marker as well, maybe. So you could make a case for something very specific like that, but I don't even know if there's a whole lot of examples other than the Nordic.
Yeah. I mean, I think the one thing that kind of comes to my mind is a lot of like the literature around like ACL prevention programs, where like we've shown that, there are programs that do have some sort of effect in that. But the problem is we don't know what about the program is necessarily leading to that reduction. So when I think about youth athletes, I generally think about, okay, what sport are they playing? They're probably playing that a lot. Where can I intervene and introduce a little bit of training variability, for lack of a better word, or what can I expose them to or kind of build up their capacity in something that they may be not getting a lot of. And I think that's kind of what a lot of the injury risk reduction around like ACL really says, is we have evidence to suggest that these things work, but we don't know what quality is really lending to that risk reduction.
So, and with that, Anna, you could put in a lot of the, like what you said, Kevin, a lot of these injury risk reduction programs look very different too. So if you look at the systematic reviews of like the ACL injury prevention programs, you can pull all the studies and they're like all different types of stuff. Sometimes they're all like FIFA 11, you'll see a lot of that obviously, but sometimes it's strengthening, sometimes it's flexibility, sometimes it's neuromuscular control, and they all seem to have some type of effect. So it's almost like just expose them to different types of movements and different vectors and planes and things that they're unaccustomed to. And that seems to maybe be the thing. And you could throw that stuff into the warm up, like every day. You could pull some of these programs and say, today's warm up is going to be single leg hopping where you land in a quarter turn. And another day you're warming up and you're doing the Copenhagen adductor plank. and another day you end with Nordics, you know, and you're just like touching them with all of these little things. And it's not perfect because you're not tracking this stuff necessarily. It's not progressive overload. It's just exposure, but you're ticking the box. And I think that's it can be, I think there's something to that. And when the rubber meets the road, you know?
So there's another question. John said, the authors mentioned utilizing the overload principle and load progression in their recommendations in part 2. Do we have any data on percentage increase week to week, or how much session RPE should increase?
No.
Load progression seems very broad. Wondering what your thoughts on this.
Yeah. It's such a good question, because it's like we can argue against AC ratios and don't really have a better, like we don't have better options or solutions. And that's what kind of sucks about this. And I try to exercise some caution when I poo-poo on things and I'm not coming back with something, but you will see from a lot of this field or this body of literature over the past 5 years also say the 10% rule of, like the 10% heuristic of week to week progression, no more than 10%. There was like, it's coming off of like one study in the early 2000s or something. And I honestly don't even know if it was an experimental study. I think it was, but the short answer to your question is no, we don't have a progression, because it would be the same. It's the same discussion. There's something to it that makes sense, but there's so many contextual factors on what you would be able to tolerate from day to day and week to week. So if your sleep and nutrition and stress levels are on point and you don't have an injury history and you're young but trained, you're probably going to be able to tolerate a pretty high increase, which could maximize performance. But if you're older, you've got an injury history, you're just divorced, you know, all that stuff, now your week to week progression is going to be a lot shorter. And some of these variables can change just like that and affect your ability to progress. So then if we go by a very rigid system, we put those blinders back on that go back to Derek's question earlier, that if we blind ourselves to some type of rigid framework, we ignore the contextual factors that we need to take into account, that we all probably do anyway, you know? So my answer is that I'm not aware of any type of heuristic there other than just your prior knowledge on this athlete's progression in the past, what they've done well on, what they have not done well on, the timeline of where you need them to be at when's the meet, when's the game, when's the season, and then your best guess is the program that you write. And then you're keeping a close eye on their external output, if it's trending in the right direction, and their subjective response to the training.
Yeah, because I mean, even with like something like the 10% rule, I think you could make a case to where that may be too conservative for a lot of people. If you're thinking about like someone who's very, you know, like if we're just going 10%, 10%, 10%, like there's people that can tolerate much more than that. So it's not a good answer. Like you mentioned, like we don't really have anything for that. So I think you can see it as almost being too conservative too. So it comes down to the individual context, like you mentioned, and accounting for all those things. I don't really have a good heuristic or rule of thumb that I follow. It's kind of more just, this is what I'm seeing. This is kind of what they tolerated last session. That's why I think the value of having like a 2-week cycle or kind of programming 2 weeks out is really useful.
So I triage. Yeah, I personally, and we're making sure that nobody is got anything to feedback. That's why we keep talking. So if you guys have thoughts, throw them out there. Travis laughs at the 10% rule, but like I'm triaging all this information that I'm getting. So if I have visual, even if they're remote athletes, videos really help, because I'm watching the movement. I'm watching the movement compared to their RPE ratings of the movement compared to what I prescribed. Like Kevin said, I'm looking at their external performance output from the previous week, comparing it to what they did this week, comparing that to their session RPE. So there's just all this information to let me know, okay, we're trending in the right direction. My prescriptions oftentimes are relatively open. Now, I will admit the athletes that I work with are typically trained well enough to make decisions within that framework. And when I say open, I say I don't prescribe set percentages or a set load. I say, you know what you did last week. We have an RPE target range that we want to stay within, so work up to that. And I'm there to make sure they're staying honest with that. If I program RPE 8 and they fail a rep, that's clearly not RPE 8. We have a discussion about that. And if that's a repeated offense, my prescriptions become much more closed, where I am saying no heavier than this, lift this weight, or lift within this range. So they kind of have to earn that right. And that's totally athlete dependent. Now, when you're coaching a bunch of teams, I got out of that game a long time ago. But if you have a group of 40 athletes, the 80-20 rule, what's going to give me 80% of the return for most of these athletes? And if percentages are easier to program and they just give people a general idea of how hard this should be, I think that's totally fine. And then you just have to kind of look at the group progression, look at the individuals and the group progression and say, maybe you've got, this is where the DAPRI, the daily autoregulatory resistance progression, Brian Mann, look up Brian Mann, APRI, DAPRI. Basically your progression is based on their performance. It's actually a really good solution to your question. I don't know why I didn't think of it. But it's their performance on a given set dictates the load that you use on the next set. And then the last set dictates the load that you're going to start with in the next session. And Brian Mann has kind of popularized that in the collegiate setting with big groups. And so it doesn't take long for these athletes to learn this system, and they can just go to the charts and they can know what they just did, and they can put the weights that they're going to use next set, put the weights they're going to use next session, boom. So that's a potentially really good option. It's also useful clinically.
Yeah, I'd say highly useful clinically, because you can have people that are, they're making such gains week to week can be incredible. So it's kind of like that. That is, I don't know why I didn't think about that, because I use that like on a daily basis too. But yeah, that's a good one.
I'm usually working with barbell sport athletes. So it's more traditional kind of training. I don't usually use those models for them. You still could, you still absolutely could. But I think that's why I didn't think of it. But like clinically, yeah, especially for just people who are using the gym to augment their other sports. They're just, looking for a general strength quality, things like that. I also love velocity-based training to nip a lot of this in the bud, but that's a different conversation. Let's see here. We have anything else?
I have a question for you, Quinn, about VBT.
Shoot.
Have you been surprised about how much volume you can accumulate before you're seeing the drop off in the specific lifts? Do you feel like you've been under prescribing previously?
It's an interesting paradox. So yes, the answer to your question is yes, I am surprised, but it's an interesting paradox. I've been under prescribing the volume, but because it seems like maybe I'm over prescribing the intensity. So if I prescribe a certain volume threshold and I say, you can accumulate, I want you to do sets of 5. And as long as the last repetition is above this, you can do a lot of different ways, but let's say the last repetition has to be at least this fast. And you can do as many sets as you can do there. I am definitely surprised with when people put intent into every repetition, how much they can maximize that. And I'm also pleasantly surprised with how much it doesn't beat them up compared to prescribing a set load that apparently is just harder than I think it is. I think people are grinding a lot more reps with high volume work, and I think it beats them up. But if you're accumulating volume with, say, no more than like a 20% or a 15% velocity drop from rep 1 to last rep, people can accumulate a lot of volume. And then of course you could, like, if they get 8 sets of 5, I'm like, okay, well, let's either I decrease your velocity threshold. So I say that you have to go even faster, or I increase your velocity threshold. So you have to go even faster so you don't get as much volume, or we go heavier. We literally put more weight on the bar at the same velocity threshold next week. But yeah.
That was my experience. So because I played around with a Tendo unit for a while, and I was just like, man, I've been training like a total puss before this. Like, I thought I was dropping off much further. And it's crazy how much more you can actually kind of get out of the training session from a volume prescription. That was what really surprised me. So I was just curious about if you were kind of finding similar things.
Yeah, I am. I'll say this though, I like to, especially with the weightlifters who are really good at like using their bodies to kind of manipulate movement. So as they can keep velocity pretty constant by using more and more bounce and manipulating their positions a little differently. So I don't want that, because I don't want, like, they can shred themselves up and I didn't even realize it, but the movement changed. It became like something different to just get the job done, like to gain the velocity, you know what I mean? So like, I want to be strict to say, no, it's a velocity at like your normal amount of bounce, like your regular squats, just try to, you know, so it's like that. But yeah, I have been pleasantly surprised with the amount of volume that one can accumulate. Just the feedback of having something there, like the intent of each repetition. Quality of training is crazy good sometimes with some of these lifters, that they have something to shoot for. Because these submaximal lifts, I mean, Taylor, as a powerlifter, I'm sure you know, like the back squat's your sport. Now I'm doing back squats for like triples at RPE 7 with this submaximal load. That's like, this is not exciting. But if you have, and plus RPE 7, fine. Like, yeah, that might've been an 8.5, whatever. Like, you don't even, like, who really sticks to that? But if you have a velocity thing there, then it's almost like its own little game. And every repetition becomes very impactful and effortful and you know, its own thing. And I feel like the quality of training really improves. There's a lot of data on that too. All right, well, I feel like when we start shifting into a completely different topic, it's probably time to wrap this up. So thanks everybody for joining us. Open up the forum application link if you want the recordings of these. You'll actually get access for the next week. We'll send that out here pretty soon. Taylor will send that out for us. You'll get access to the recording for a week. And then if you want all the recordings, they're in the forum. Really appreciate you guys joining us on a Friday. Kevin and Taylor, thank you. This was really good.
Yeah, this was a good one.
Awesome.
Any topics for next week or 2 weeks, whenever?
Yeah, real quick, guys, if you want to throw out some potential topics, throw them out in the chat. We've got a few, I think, in the bank from previous polls, but it never hurts to throw some out there.
Hamstring rehab, Kevin?
No, just no.
Niggles almost won. I think
That would be a
Niggles,
good one. Yeah.
I think it might have won if people in the US even knew what the term niggles was. Like, I had so many people PM me and were like, what the hell does that even mean? Niggles? But like, that paper is really interesting. So it's like all the little things, like a niggle is like just a little bump, bruise, ache that we tend to get. So the question is, does that precede something bigger? And is there data? Should we start paying attention a little bit more to these little things that we tend to just brush off and say, oh, you know, it's just part of the process, blah, 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 blah. So I'll probably throw that one back into the hat.
So you're going to that means that things are getting more complicated then.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So Travis put in the Whale in 2019 article. Travis, can you put the title or the link here? Because I'm sure I can just copy and figure out what you're talking about, but I'm not actually familiar. Oh, yeah. That the Nichols article. I wasn't familiar with the lead author. There you go. Thank you. Cool. This is the exact paper that we were just talking about. I haven't read it yet. I'm just interested in the topic, so I'll read it if you guys pick it. Travis, have you read it? Is it any good? Okay, there you go. Cool. Okay, so if you guys can always send us an email if you have ideas. Max said that he's going to volunteer to be the meeting scribe, I think. So thanks for that, Max. This was a lot of fun, everyone. When you close out Zoom, you will be taken to a feedback page. It's real quick. It'll take you 20 seconds, but that's what helps us keep these things valuable for you guys. So give any feedback, how we can make them better. The most common feedback that we get is making it more interactive, which Zoom webinar is a little bit limited. There's not breakout rooms in Zoom webinar. There are breakout rooms in Zoom meeting. The problem with Zoom meeting is that everybody's kind of there and people forget to mute themselves. There's more like logistical weirdness with a Zoom meeting versus a webinar like this, but we kind of figured out one of my solutions was just making that intra meeting poll question, that token poll question, but it's a work in progress. Okay, we'll end it there. Thanks everyone. See you next time.